Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between? I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The silver dollar rolled across the saloon floor like a dying prayer, coming to rest beside the spittoon where Lucien Dubois had collapsed, after the three Vasquez brothers finished using him as entertainment for the crowd at the Golden Serpent. Blood trickled from his split lip as he reached for the coin, his last possession in a world that had stripped him of everything else, including his dignity. The laughter of the brothers echoed through the smoky air, like the sound of crows picking at carrion, their cruel amusement growing louder as the broken cowboy's trembling fingers grasped the dollar that represented the difference between one more night with a roof over his head and sleeping in the desert where coyotes sang death songs. "Look at this pathetic fool," sneered Diego Vasquez, the eldest brother whose scarred face told stories of violence that had made him wealthy while honest men starved. "Crawling on the ground for pennies like a mangy dog begging for scraps from his master's table. This is what happens to dreamers who think they can strike it rich in our territory without paying proper tribute to men who understand how business really works in places where law is whatever we say it is." His boots were inches from Lucien's face, polished leather that cost more than most men earned in a month, purchased with profits from claim jumping and worse crimes that the territorial authorities preferred to ignore rather than investigate. The crowd that had gathered to watch the beating was typical of the Golden Serpent's clientele, miners, drifters, and criminals who found entertainment in watching weaker men suffer because it reminded them that someone else had fallen further than they had in territories where survival often required abandoning human decency in favor of predatory instincts that served individual interests rather than community welfare. Their faces showed the kind of callous indifference that frontier life bred in people who'd learned to view compassion as luxury they couldn't afford when their own survival depended on staying invisible to predators who ruled through fear. Lucien's attempt to stand was met with Ramon Vasquez's boot to his ribs, the middle brother's casual violence designed to keep their victim on the ground where he belonged, according to social hierarchy that placed honest failure below criminal success in territories where wealth determined worth, regardless of how that wealth had been acquired. "Stay down, boy," Ramon growled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never faced serious challenge to his brutality. "You haven't earned the right to stand in the presence of your betters, and you never will as long as you're fool enough to believe that hard work means more than knowing when to take what you want from people too weak to stop you." But in the corner booth where shadows gathered like prophecy, someone had been watching the humiliation with eyes that missed nothing and a stillness that suggested violence waiting for the proper moment to reveal itself. The stranger's hand rested casually near his gun, fingers steady despite the rage building in his chest as he witnessed cruelty that demanded response from anyone who remembered what justice looked like when law failed and good men had to choose between action and complicity. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the saloon's noise like a blade through silk, carrying authority that made even hardened criminals pause their revelry to listen. "That's enough." Armand Rousseau had been watching the Golden Serpent for 3 days, gathering intelligence on the Vasquez brothers' operation while nursing whiskey that burned less than memories of similar injustices he'd witnessed throughout territories where criminal organizations thrived in the absence of effective law enforcement. His reputation as the Shadow of Santa Fe had been built on eliminating exactly these kinds of predators, men who confused strength with cruelty and success with systematic exploitation of honest people, whose only crime was believing that hard work would be rewarded rather than punished by those with power to protect or destroy dreams. The letter in his coat pocket had brought him to this god-forsaken mining town, written in shaking handwriting by a woman whose son had been murdered by the Vasquez brothers for refusing to sell his claim for a fraction of its value. "They killed my boy for defending what was rightfully his," the letter read. "The law won't help because they own the sheriff, and federal marshals are too far away to care about one dead miner in a territory full of graves that nobody bothers to mark. If you're truly the man they say you are, someone who protects the innocent when nobody else will, then I'm begging you to bring justice to men who think themselves above God's judgment." Maria Santos had enclosed her life savings with that letter, $47 that represented years of taking in laundry and selling eggs to save enough money for a gravestone that would bear her son's name instead of just another wooden cross in a cemetery full of forgotten dreams. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on Armand's conscience, because he understood that some obligations transcended monetary payment to become moral debts that could only be settled through actions that honored the memory of those who died believing justice was possible in a world that seemed designed to reward evil while punishing good. The irony of watching another young man being destroyed by the same criminals who'd killed Eduardo Santos wasn't lost on Armand, whose 20 years of hunting predators had taught him that evil followed patterns as predictable as weather, always seeking the weakest targets while avoiding confrontation with anyone capable of meaningful resistance. The Vasquez brothers represented everything wrong with frontier territories where federal authority was too distant to provide protection and local law enforcement served whoever could afford to purchase loyalty that should have been given freely to constitutional principles. Lucien Dubois reminded Armand of his younger self, before tragedy had transformed idealistic dreams into grim determination to protect others from experiencing losses that had shaped his transformation from hopeful immigrant to legendary gunfighter whose skills served justice rather than personal profit. The boy's dignity in the face of degradation revealed character that deserved protection rather than destruction. And Armand's decision to intervene was made not from professional obligation, but from recognition that some moments defined whether civilization would advance or retreat in territories where individual choices shaped collective destiny for generations yet unborn. 3 months earlier, Lucien had believed himself the luckiest man in Colorado territory when old Henrik Larsson had sold him a mining claim for everything the young cowboy had saved from 2 years of breaking horses and herding cattle across landscapes that had tested his endurance while building character that his father would have been proud to witness. The Norwegian prospector had seemed eager to leave the territory, his nervous manner suggesting urgency that Lucien had attributed to homesickness rather than fear of men who'd learned his claim contained more than iron ore and quartz. "The mountains hold secrets that wise men leave buried," Henrik had warned as he accepted Lucien's payment, his weathered hands shaking as he counted bills that represented freedom from threats that had been growing more violent as the Vasquez brothers' patience, with his refusal to sell at their insulting prices, had worn thin. Sometimes what looks like blessing becomes curse, when wrong people learn what you've found in places where they think nothing valuable should exist without their permission. Be careful. "Boy, this territory has teeth that bite deeper than winter wind." The first samples Lucien had taken from his claim had revealed trace amounts of silver that suggested substantial deposits deeper in the mountain, where previous mining had barely scratched the surface of wealth that could transform a poor cowboy into someone with resources enough to build the kind of life his parents had dreamed of when they'd left Louisiana, with hopes that hard work would be rewarded rather than exploited by those with power to steal what others had earned through honest labor and determination that meant more than comfort or safety. But the assayer's report that had made Lucien's heart race with possibilities had also sealed his fate, because information like that couldn't remain secret in towns where everyone's business became public knowledge through networks of spies and informants who served criminal organizations that viewed legitimate success as threat to their monopoly on wealth acquisition through methods that bypassed honest work in favor of theft disguised as business enterprise that served predatory interests rather than community welfare. The Vasquez brothers' campaign of intimidation had begun the day after Henrik disappeared, his departure so sudden and complete that his boarding house room had been left exactly as if he'd simply stepped outside for air and forgotten to return. Broken equipment, poisoned water supplies, and threats against anyone who might help Lucian work his claim had systematically destroyed his ability to extract the silver that could have provided security for someone whose only crime had been believing that honest effort would be protected rather than punished by men who viewed law as commodity to be purchased rather than principle to be honored. The Vasquez brothers controlled half the mining claims in the territory through methods that combined legal manipulation with physical intimidation. Their success built on understanding that most honest miners lacked resources to challenge theft, disguised as legitimate business transactions that transferred wealth from those who'd found it to those who'd learned to take it without facing consequences, from authorities who preferred profitable corruption to dangerous justice. Diego's intelligence and ruthlessness had made him wealthy, while Ramon's brutality and Carlos's charm had made them feared throughout regions where their word carried more weight than territorial law. Their empire had been built, claim by claim, family by family, through systematic elimination of competition that left survivors with choices between collaboration and exodus to territories where starting over was possible but not guaranteed without capital, that honest work couldn't provide quickly enough to escape debts that accumulated faster than legitimate profits in economic systems designed to transfer wealth upward, regardless of who actually created value through productive labor. Those who refused their offers found their equipment destroyed, their water supplies contaminated, and their families threatened until resistance became impossible to maintain. The Golden Serpent served as their unofficial headquarters, a place where territorial officials came to receive instructions disguised as requests, and where territorial maps were redrawn according to Vasquez interests rather than legal surveys that might have protected legitimate claims from appropriation through judicial proceedings that served predetermined outcomes rather than constitutional principles. The saloon's back room contained records that would have interested federal investigators if any federal investigators had been brave enough to venture into territories where their authority meant less than local power structures. Sheriff Miguel Torres wore a badge that meant whatever the Vasquez brothers decided it should mean, his authority extending only as far as their interests required and no further than their tolerance allowed when conflicts arose between their profits and legal obligations that might have protected citizens from exploitation by criminal organizations that viewed territorial government as hunting preserve for predatory enterprises. His salary came from sources that had nothing to do with territorial appropriations and everything to do with maintaining arrangements that kept federal attention focused elsewhere. The network of corruption that the brothers had created extended beyond local boundaries to include territorial judges, federal appointees, and business interests that profited from stability that came through accommodation with criminal organizations rather than challenge to authority that served predatory interests more reliably than constitutional law ever had in regions where distance from federal oversight made local arrangements more important than national principles that meant nothing without enforcement by people willing to risk everything for others. Lucian's final humiliation at the Golden Serpent represented culmination of 3 months of systematic destruction that had reduced him from hopeful mine owner to broken vagrant who couldn't afford meals, much less equipment needed to work claims that remained legally his but practically belonged to men who'd learned to take what they wanted without paying for it. The silver dollar that Carlos kicked from his grasp had been intended for bread that would keep him alive another day, while he figured out how to survive in territory where his legitimate ownership meant less than Vasquez's desire for properties they'd decided to acquire. "You're done, boy," Carlos announced with theatrical cruelty that entertained the crowd while serving notice to other potential resistors about consequences of refusing Vasquez's generosity when it was offered, rather than waiting for it to be taken through methods that left former owners with nothing except regrets about decisions that had seemed principled before reality demonstrated costs of principle in territories where survival required accommodation with predatory authority. "Pack up whatever's left of your pathetic gear and get out of our territory before we decide you're worth killing instead of just breaking." The papers that Carlos threw at Lucian's feet were transfer documents that would sign over his claim for the insulting sum of $50, payment that represented final insult to someone whose legitimate ownership was being stolen through legal manipulation that made theft appear voluntary rather than coerced through violence that territorial authorities preferred to ignore rather than investigate when investigation might threaten profitable arrangements that served everyone except victims who lacked political influence. "Sign these and take your $50, or refuse and take nothing except whatever injuries we decide you've earned through stupidity." The crowd's laughter grew louder as Lucian's hand trembled over papers that would sign away his future along with his present, their entertainment deriving from witnessing destruction of someone whose hope made him vulnerable to predators who'd learned to profit from others' dreams by crushing them systematically until resistance became impossible to maintain through individual effort that meant nothing against organized criminal enterprise that controlled territorial resources through corruption and violence that served predetermined outcomes. But the sudden silence that fell over the Golden Serpent when Armand Rousseau stood up from his corner table carried weight that even the Vasquez brothers couldn't ignore. Because some reputations transcended local authority to represent forces that criminal organizations had learned to fear despite their control of territorial law enforcement and judicial proceedings. When he spoke again, his voice carried promise of consequences that money couldn't prevent and political influence couldn't survive. "I said that's enough, and I meant it." Armand's reputation preceded him into confrontations like morning mist preceding sunrise, his presence transforming casual cruelty into something far more dangerous, as every person in the Golden Serpent suddenly understood they were witnessing a moment that would either end in immediate bloodshed or become legend that would be told in frontier saloons for decades to come. The Vasquez brothers had heard stories about the shadow of Santa Fe, but facing him across 20 feet of sawdust floor made those stories feel like children's tales compared to reality of man whose stillness suggested death itself, waiting for proper moment to reveal its presence. "Well, well," Diego said, his voice carrying confidence that had been shaken, but not broken by recognition of who'd chosen to interfere with their entertainment, because local power had protected them from serious challenge for 3 years of systematic exploitation that had made them wealthy while teaching them wrong lessons about their own invincibility. "The famous Armand Rousseau, come to play hero for a worthless saddle tramp who's too stupid to accept generous offer for property that'll be ours anyway once we're finished with him. I hope you're not planning to make this unpleasant for everyone involved." "That depends on you," Armand replied, his hand resting casually near his gun in position that suggested readiness without threatening immediate violence, because he understood that some men required education before elimination, and that wisdom sometimes meant offering chances for redemption that weren't always accepted by criminals whose pride exceeded their intelligence. "The boy keeps his claim. You pay him fair value for any damages you've caused, and we all walk away from this without blood on the floor. Simple terms that even men of your limited intelligence should be able to understand." Ramon's laughter was harsh and disbelieving, because the middle brother had built his reputation on intimidating people who couldn't fight back and had never faced an opponent whose skills had been tested in situations where losing meant dying and victory required capabilities that exceeded anything necessary for terrorizing honest citizens. You think your reputation gives you right to walk into our town and dictate terms to men who own everything worth owning in this territory? You're just one man with delusions about justice in place where justice means whatever we say, it means. The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop as Armand's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something far more dangerous. His transformation from negotiator to predator occurring so gradually that most witnesses couldn't identify exact moment when diplomacy had been replaced by promise of violence that would be swift and final if circumstances required solutions that talking couldn't provide. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice carrying certainty that made smart men nervous and stupid ones overconfident. "I am just one man. But I'm the one man in this territory who's killed more criminals than you've robbed. And I'm the one man whose conscience won't let him walk away when decent people need protection from predators who mistake local influence for divine immunity." The silence that followed Armand's declaration stretched through the golden serpent like held breath, because everyone present understood they were witnessing confrontation between two different philosophies of frontier justice, one that served whatever interests could afford to purchase loyalty, and another that served principles too fundamental to be bought or sold, regardless of immediate consequences, for those who chose honor over safety when circumstances demanded choice between right and wrong. The Vasquez brothers represented everything corrupt about territorial authority, while Armand embodied possibility that individual conscience could triumph over organized evil when supported by skills that made moral principles practical rather than merely theoretical. "Last chance," Armand said, his words carrying finality that suggested negotiation phase was ending, and violence phase would begin if criminal pride proved stronger than survival instincts that should have warned the brothers about challenging someone whose reputation was built on eliminating men exactly like them in situations where legal authority had failed to protect innocent people from predatory exploitation. Fair payment for damages, return of stolen property, and departure from this territory within 24 hours. Accept those terms or face consequences that your local influence can't prevent and your money can't survive. Diego's calculation of their situation revealed odds that had shifted dramatically against them, despite numerical advantage and local support that had previously protected them from serious challenge to authority they'd built through systematic intimidation of people who couldn't fight back against coordinated criminal enterprise. But pride and 3 years of unchallenged success made retreat seem impossible, even when intelligence suggested that discretion would serve their interests better than confrontation with legendary gunfighter whose skills had been proven in situations where reputation meant difference between life and death. "Boys," Diego said to his brothers, his voice carrying authority that had been built through years of successful criminal enterprise, but was now being tested against opponent whose moral authority transcended local political arrangements that had protected them from consequences of activities that federal law enforcement would have prosecuted if federal law enforcement had been present in sufficient force to challenge territorial corruption that served criminal interests. "Seems like our famous visitor needs education about how business works in territories where established arrangements take precedence over outside interference from men who don't understand local customs." The crowd began backing away from potential battlefield as understanding dawned that entertainment was about to become tragedy for someone. Though whether that someone would be local criminals or legendary gunfighter remained to be determined through contest that would test whether justice could triumph over corruption when supported by superior skill, applied with deadly precision against enemies who'd forgotten that some principles were worth dying for, regardless of personal cost or likelihood of success against impossible odds. Carlos Vasquez died before his gun cleared leather. Armand's draw so fast, it seemed to occur outside normal time, while his shot placement demonstrated precision that transformed theoretical reputation into practical demonstration of capabilities that had made him legendary throughout territories, where survival often depended on split-second decisions that determined whether justice or corruption would prevail in communities where federal authority was too distant to provide protection for innocent people who deserved better than abandonment to predatory organizations. The thunder of gunfire transformed the Golden Serpent from place of entertainment into scene of judgment, where moral principles were being enforced through methods that civilization preferred to forget, but frontier life made necessary when legal systems failed to protect citizens from criminal organizations that viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than neighbors deserving respect and protection under constitutional law that meant something only when enforced by people willing to risk everything for others. "One down," Armand announced calmly, his weapon already back in its holster, despite fact that two armed enemies remained capable of continuing hostilities if their intelligence proved insufficient to overcome pride that had been damaged by witnessing their brother's death at hands of someone whose skills exceeded anything they'd previously encountered in 3 years of terrorizing people who couldn't defend themselves against organized brutality that served criminal interests rather than community welfare. Ramon's charge across the saloon floor was motivated by rage rather than tactics, his massive frame carrying him toward opponent whose rifle work had just eliminated youngest brother, but whose close combat skills remained untested by men whose experience had been limited to intimidating honest citizens rather than fighting trained killers whose reputations were built on surviving exactly these kinds of impossible odds against superior numbers that should have provided decisive advantage in any reasonable assessment of tactical situation. But Armand's response to Ramon's assault was surgical in its precision, his second shot taking the middle brother in center of chest with accuracy that stopped his forward momentum while demonstrating difference between killing for necessity and killing for pleasure to witnesses whose understanding of frontier justice was being expanded through practical demonstration of what happened when predators encountered superior predator whose moral principles governed when and why he used deadly skills that served protection of innocent people rather than exploitation of their weakness. Diego Vasquez found himself alone against opponent whose capabilities had just been demonstrated through elimination of both brothers in span of seconds that had transformed certain victory into probable death sentence. His tactical assessment revealing situation where local influence meant nothing against superior skill, applied with deadly precision by someone whose moral authority transcended territorial political arrangements that had protected criminal organizations from consequences of activities that violated every principle of constitutional law that was supposed to govern frontier territories. "Wait," Diego said, his hands moving slowly away from his weapons in gesture that might have been surrender if his eyes hadn't been calculating angles and distances that might provide opportunity for surprise attack against opponent whose attention seemed focused, but might be vulnerable to deception from someone whose survival had depended on exploiting others' assumptions about his character and capabilities during 3 years of successful criminal enterprise. "Your brothers are dead because they chose violence over reason," Armand replied, his voice carrying certainty that came from understanding exactly what Diego was considering and why such consideration would prove as fatal as his brother's decisions to continue fighting rather than accepting terms that would have allowed them to survive encounter with someone whose reputation for mercy was matched only by his skills at eliminating those who proved themselves beyond redemption through actions that revealed character rather than just immediate desperation. "The boy gets his claim back," Armand continued, His gun still holstered despite obvious danger from remaining opponent, whose intelligence made him more dangerous than his brothers had been, because intelligent enemies were capable of learning from mistakes that dead men couldn't correct through future decisions that might serve survival, rather than pride that had destroyed 2/3 of criminal organization in less than a minute of violence that had demonstrated costs of challenging moral authority with force that served selfish interests. Diego's final gambit involved diving behind the bar while drawing concealed weapon that represented last hope for survival that seemed increasingly unlikely against opponent whose legendary skills were being demonstrated through practical application rather than mere reputation that might have been exaggerated through frontier storytelling that often transformed ordinary events into mythical narratives designed to entertain rather than educate audiences about realities of life in territories where individual choices shaped collective destiny for communities whose future depended on whether good men or bad men controlled resources and authority. Armand's third shot punched through the wooden bar as if it were paper, finding Diego behind his inadequate cover with precision that ended the Vasquez brothers' criminal empire in explosion of splinters and blood that left no doubt about outcome of confrontation between organized corruption and individual conscience, supported by skills that made moral principles practical rather than merely theoretical concepts that meant nothing without enforcement capabilities that could challenge criminal authority on terms that criminals understood. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound and absolute, broken only by sound of gunpowder smoke drifting through air that had been transformed from atmosphere of casual cruelty into something resembling cathedral where divine justice had been administered through human agency that served principles too fundamental to be corrupted by local political arrangements that had protected criminal organizations from consequences of activities that violated every standard of human decency. "It's over," Armand announced to the crowd, whose entertainment had become education about difference between reputation and reality when legendary capabilities were applied in service of protecting innocent people from predatory exploitation by criminal organizations that had viewed territorial authority as hunting preserve for activities that served individual greed rather than community welfare that required protection from those with power to provide it. Lucien struggled to his feet with dignity that had been damaged but not destroyed by months of systematic humiliation designed to break his spirit before breaking his body. His survival through ordeal that would have destroyed weaker men testimony to character that deserved protection rather than exploitation from predators who'd mistaken vulnerability for worthlessness in calculations that had proven as fatal as they were morally bankrupt. "The claims office opens at 8 tomorrow morning," Armand told Lucien, his voice carrying warmth that few people had ever heard from someone whose reputation was built on bringing death to those who deserved it, while protecting those who deserved better than abandonment to criminal organizations that viewed human beings as resources to be exploited, rather than neighbors deserving respect and protection under constitutional law that meant something when enforced by people willing to risk everything for others. The real reason Armand had come to this territory wasn't revealed in Maria Santos's letter or his professional obligation to eliminate criminal organizations that preyed on innocent families. It was contained in documents hidden in his saddlebags that proved the Vasquez brothers had been operating under protection of territorial governor, whose corruption extended far beyond local arrangements to include federal contracts that had made him wealthy through systematic theft of mining revenues that belonged to territorial treasury rather than private accounts that served individual enrichment at expense of public welfare. Governor William Morrison's involvement in territorial corruption had been carefully concealed through network of intermediaries and shell companies that transferred stolen wealth through legitimate business transactions that appeared legal to anyone lacking access to complete financial records that revealed patterns of systematic theft disguised as administrative fees and territorial development expenses that served private interests rather than public good that constitutional government was supposed to protect. The evidence that Armand carried represented culmination of 2-year federal investigation that had been conducted in secret because territorial corruption extended to judicial appointments and law enforcement positions that had been purchased by criminal organizations whose influence made conventional prosecution impossible through normal legal channels, that required cooperation from officials whose loyalty had been bought by men who viewed government authority as commodity to be acquired rather than responsibility to be honored. Lucian's claim was valuable not just for silver deposits that the Vasquez brothers had been stealing through systematic intimidation, but because it occupied strategic position that controlled access to mountain passes where territorial militia had been moving weapons and supplies to Confederate sympathizers whose activities represented treason that federal authorities had been unable to prosecute due to territorial corruption that protected criminal organizations from investigation by outside authorities whose jurisdiction threatened profitable arrangements. The shooting that had just eliminated 3 criminals was also elimination of key witnesses whose testimony might have implicated territorial officials in activities that extended far beyond local corruption, to include federal crimes that carried death penalties for activities that had been generating substantial profits through systematic exploitation of territorial resources that belonged to American people rather than criminal organizations that had learned to steal public wealth through private arrangements. Sheriff Torres's arrival at the Golden Serpent with 6 deputies represented territorial authorities' response to violence that had disrupted criminal arrangements worth more than most men could imagine. His badge-carrying authority that served whoever paid his salary rather than constitutional principles that were supposed to govern law enforcement activities in territories where federal oversight was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of corruption that had made criminal organizations wealthy through systematic theft of public resources. Armand Rousseau, Torres announced as he surveyed scene of justified violence that had eliminated men whose deaths would be mourned only by criminal associates who'd profited from their activities. You're under arrest for murder of 3 upstanding citizens whose only crime was defending their legitimate business interests against outside interference from men who don't understand how territorial law works in regions where local customs take precedence over federal regulations. The warrant that Torres produced had been prepared in advance of confrontation that territorial authorities had anticipated would occur when legendary gunfighters' investigation threatened criminal enterprises that had been generating substantial revenues through activities that required protection from legal prosecution that might have exposed network of corruption extending to territorial capital, where governor's office had been coordinating systematic theft of federal resources allocated for territorial development. "Those men were criminals," Armand replied, his voice carrying certainty that came from possession of evidence that would prove territorial corruption if federal authorities could be convinced to investigate activities that local law enforcement had been protecting through arrangements that served criminal interests rather than constitutional law that was supposed to govern territorial administration according to federal regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of systematic exploitation. But Torres's response revealed depth of corruption that extended beyond local arrangements to include coordination with territorial authorities whose involvement in criminal enterprises made them vulnerable to federal prosecution if evidence of their activities reached investigators whose authority transcended territorial political arrangements that had protected criminal organizations from consequences of activities that violated federal law as well as basic human decency that should have governed official conduct. The telegram that arrived at the territorial capital while Torres was arresting Armand contained authorization from federal investigators whose jurisdiction superseded territorial authority when crimes involved theft of federal resources or coordination with Confederate sympathizers whose activities represented treason that carried death penalties regardless of political connections or territorial influence that might have protected criminals from local prosecution but couldn't prevent federal investigation of activities that threatened national security as well as territorial welfare. Federal Marshal John Baptiste arrived in town on evening train that brought reinforcements whose authority transcended territorial political arrangements. His credentials backed by federal warrants that had been prepared through investigation that had documented systematic theft of territorial resources through criminal organizations that had been operating under protection of officials whose corruption had made them vulnerable to federal prosecution that could result in death sentences for activities that constituted treason as well as theft. "Release him immediately," Baptiste ordered Torres. His federal authority carrying weight that territorial badges couldn't challenge when backed by evidence that proved local law enforcement had been protecting criminal organizations whose activities violated federal law as well as territorial regulations that were supposed to govern mining operations and territorial development according to constitutional principles rather than criminal convenience that served individual enrichment at expense of public welfare. The documents that Baptiste carried proved Armand's identity as federal agent, whose investigation had been authorized at highest levels of government, where territorial corruption had attracted attention from officials whose authority transcended local political arrangements that had protected criminal organizations from prosecution through conventional legal channels that required cooperation from territorial authorities whose loyalty had been purchased by men who viewed government as business opportunity rather than public service. Lucien's role in federal investigation became clear when Baptiste explained that legitimate mining claims like his were being used to establish federal jurisdiction over territories where criminal organizations had been operating under protection of corrupt officials whose activities represented systematic theft of resources that belonged to American people rather than private interests that had learned to exploit governmental authority for personal gain that violated every principle of constitutional government. Governor Morrison's response to federal intervention was swift and desperate. His activation of territorial militia representing last-ditch attempt to prevent investigation that would expose network of corruption extending to territorial capital, where systematic theft of federal resources had been generating substantial personal wealth through activities that constituted treason, as well as theft that carried death penalties regardless of political connections or territorial influence that had previously protected criminal organizations from prosecution. The militia's arrival in town, with orders to arrest federal agents, represented escalation that transformed local corruption into armed rebellion against federal authority, their actions constituting treason that would justify military intervention if territorial authorities continued to resist federal investigation of activities that had been documented through evidence that proved systematic theft of resources allocated for territorial development according to constitutional principles rather than criminal convenience. "Stand down," Baptiste ordered militia commander, whose authority derived from territorial appointments that meant nothing when contradicted by federal warrants backed by evidence of criminal activities that had been conducted under protection of officials whose corruption had made them vulnerable to prosecution for crimes that carried death penalties regardless of local political arrangements that had previously provided immunity from legal consequences. The standoff that developed between federal agents and territorial militia represented constitutional crisis where state and federal authority were in direct conflict over jurisdiction that would determine whether territorial corruption could continue operating under protection of local law enforcement or would face federal prosecution that could result in death sentences for activities that violated both territorial and federal law while threatening national security through coordination with Confederate sympathizers. Armand's position in this conflict was complicated by his official status as federal agent, whose investigation had provided evidence that proved territorial corruption, while his personal commitment to protecting Lucien represented moral obligation that transcended professional duty to serve federal interests when those interests conflicted with immediate need to protect innocent people from retaliation by criminal organizations whose survival depended on eliminating witnesses who could testify about activities that had been documented through federal investigation. The gun battle that erupted through the town's streets represented collision between federal law enforcement and territorial corruption that had been inevitable since criminal organizations had begun operating under protection of officials whose loyalty could be purchased by anyone willing to pay sufficient bribes to ensure that law enforcement served private interests rather than constitutional principles that were supposed to govern territorial administration according to federal regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of systematic exploitation. Lucian's transformation from victim to participant occurred when militia forces attempted to arrest him as material witness whose testimony could implicate territorial officials in criminal activities that federal investigation had documented through evidence that proved systematic theft of resources allocated for territorial development through legal channels that had been corrupted to serve private interests rather than public welfare that constitutional government was supposed to protect. "They're trying to silence anyone who can testify about what really happened here," Armand explained as they took cover behind overturned wagons that provided minimal protection from rifle fire that was becoming increasingly accurate as militia forces established positions that commanded approaches to federal agents whose authority was being challenged by territorial forces whose loyalty served criminal organizations rather than constitutional law that was supposed to govern their conduct. The citizens who joined federal agents in defending their town against territorial militia represented triumph of local conscience over official corruption. Their participation in battle against appointed authority, demonstrating that democratic principles could prevail over criminal organizations when ordinary people were willing to risk everything for protection of constitutional law that served community welfare rather than individual enrichment through systematic exploitation of public resources. Federal reinforcements arrived on midnight train that brought military support whose authority transcended territorial political arrangements. Their intervention representing federal government's commitment to enforcing constitutional law in territories where local corruption had made civilian law enforcement impossible through conventional methods that required cooperation from officials whose loyalty had been purchased by criminal organizations that viewed governmental authority as business opportunity rather than public responsibility. Governor Morrison's arrival in town with remaining loyal forces represented final attempt to prevent federal investigation from exposing network of corruption that extended beyond territorial boundaries to include federal contracts and military supplies that had been diverted to Confederate sympathizers whose activities constituted treason that would result in death sentences if evidence reached federal prosecutors whose authority transcended territorial political arrangements that had previously protected criminal organizations from legal consequences. The siege that developed around the federal agent's position represented constitutional crisis, where territorial and federal authority were in direct conflict over jurisdiction that would determine future of territorial government and its relationship to federal oversight that was supposed to prevent exactly the kind of systematic corruption that had made criminal organizations wealthy through theft of public resources allocated for territorial development according to constitutional principles. "Surrender now and face federal prosecution," Baptiste announced through speaking trumpet that carried his voice across battlefield, where territorial militia was defending criminal organizations against federal law enforcement, whose investigation had documented activities that violated both territorial and federal law while threatening national security through coordination with Confederate sympathizers whose treason carried death penalties regardless of territorial political connections. Morrison's response revealed desperation of man whose criminal activities had made him vulnerable to federal prosecution that would result in death sentence if evidence of his involvement in systematic theft and treason reached federal courts whose jurisdiction transcended territorial political arrangements that had previously provided immunity from legal consequences for activities that had generated substantial personal wealth through exploitation of public resources. The explosion that destroyed Territorial Records Office represented Morrison's attempt to eliminate evidence that federal investigation had been seeking. his destruction of documents that proved systematic theft of federal resources, constituting additional federal crime that would be added to charges of treason and corruption that already carried death penalties, regardless of territorial political connections or influence that might have protected him from local prosecution, but couldn't prevent federal investigation of activities that threatened national security. Morrison's death came from his own hand as federal agents closed in on position where he'd made final stand against investigation that had exposed network of corruption extending to territorial capital. His suicide representing admission of guilt for activities that had constituted treason as well as theft of federal resources allocated for territorial development according to constitutional principles, rather than criminal convenience that had served individual enrichment at expense of public welfare and national security. The surrender of remaining militia forces marked end of territorial resistance to federal authority, their capitulation representing triumph of constitutional law over criminal organizations that had been operating under protection of corrupt officials whose activities had violated every principle of democratic government, while generating substantial personal wealth through systematic exploitation of public resources that belonged to American people rather than private interests. "It's over," Baptiste announced, as federal forces secured territorial capital and arrested surviving officials whose involvement in criminal activities had been documented through investigation that proved systematic theft of resources allocated for territorial development. Their prosecution, representing federal government's commitment to enforcing constitutional law in territories where local corruption had made civilian law enforcement impossible through conventional methods. Lucien's claim was formally restored through federal court order that recognized his legitimate ownership while providing compensation for damages inflicted by criminal organizations whose activities had been conducted under protection of territorial officials whose corruption had made them vulnerable to federal prosecution for crimes that carried death penalties regardless of political connections or territorial influence that had previously provided immunity from legal consequences. The silver deposits that made Lucien's claim valuable were developed through legitimate mining operations that provided employment for territorial residents while generating tax revenues that supported territorial government according to constitutional principles rather than criminal arrangements that had previously transferred public wealth to private accounts through systematic theft, disguised as administrative fees and territorial development expenses that served individual enrichment rather than community welfare. 6 months after the battle that had eliminated territorial corruption, Perdition Creek had been transformed from criminal-controlled territory into legitimate community where federal law enforcement provided protection for citizens whose rights were guaranteed by constitutional principles rather than whatever criminal organizations decided to permit, through arrangements that served private interests at expense of public welfare and individual safety that democracy was supposed to protect through governmental authority that served people rather than exploiting them. Lucien's silver mine had become territorial success story that demonstrated how legitimate business operations could provide prosperity for entire communities when conducted according to federal regulations that protected both environmental resources and worker safety, while generating tax revenues that supported territorial government according to constitutional principles, rather than criminal arrangements that had previously transferred public wealth to private accounts through systematic theft. The school that federal authorities established in town prioritized civic education that prepared territorial residents for eventual statehood, while teaching democratic principles that would prevent future corruption through citizen participation in governmental processes that served public welfare rather than private interests that had previously exploited territorial resources for individual enrichment at expense of community development and national security that constitutional government was supposed to protect. Armand's appointment as territorial marshal provided ongoing law enforcement that could prevent criminal organizations from re-establishing operations that had previously thrived under protection of corrupt officials whose activities had violated federal law, as well as basic principles of human decency, that should have governed official conduct in territories where federal oversight was supposed to ensure constitutional government rather than systematic exploitation of public resources. The marriage that developed between Armand and Dr. Sarah Moreau, the town's physician who'd treated victims of territorial corruption while maintaining medical practice that served community welfare rather than individual profit, represented personal happiness that complemented professional satisfaction of having eliminated criminal organizations that had threatened both territorial residents and national security through activities that had constituted treason as well as theft of federal resources. The federal trials that followed territorial liberation resulted in death sentences for surviving officials whose involvement in systematic theft and treason had been documented through investigation that proved criminal activities extending beyond territorial boundaries to include coordination with Confederate sympathizers whose activities had threatened national security as well as territorial welfare, through systematic exploitation of public resources that belonged to American people rather than private interests that had purchased governmental authority. The compensation that federal government provided to victims of territorial corruption included restoration of stolen property, as well as monetary damages that recognized years of systematic exploitation by criminal organizations that had operated under protection of officials whose activities had violated every principle of constitutional government, while generating substantial personal wealth through theft of public resources allocated for territorial development according to federal regulations. Lucien's transformation from broken victim to prosperous mine owner represented individual success that demonstrated how federal protection of constitutional rights could enable honest citizens to prosper through legitimate business operations that contributed to community welfare while providing personal security that had been impossible under territorial corruption that had served criminal organizations rather than public interests that democracy was supposed to protect. The memorial that community erected honored victims of territorial corruption while celebrating triumph of constitutional law over criminal organizations that had threatened both individual safety and national security through activities that had been conducted under protection of officials whose loyalty could be purchased by anyone willing to pay sufficient bribes to ensure that governmental authority served private interests rather than public welfare. The territorial constitution that federal authorities helped draft included provisions designed to prevent future corruption through citizen oversight of governmental activities while guaranteeing individual rights that had been systematically violated by criminal organizations that had viewed territorial authority as business opportunity rather than public responsibility that should have served community welfare according to democratic principles rather than criminal convenience. 10 years later, Lucien Dubois stood on the porch of his mansion overlooking silver mines that had made him one of the wealthiest men in Colorado. But his greatest treasure wasn't measured in precious metals extracted from mountains that had nearly cost him everything. It was the community that had been built through cooperation between federal authorities and territorial residents whose commitment to constitutional principles had transformed criminal-controlled territory into model of democratic government that served public welfare rather than private interests. The children attending school that bore Armand's name learned not just reading and arithmetic, but civic responsibility that would prepare them for citizenship in democratic society where individual rights were protected by governmental authority that served people rather than exploiting them through criminal organizations that had previously viewed territorial resources as hunting preserve for activities that generated private wealth at expense of public welfare and national security. The silver dollar that had rolled across saloon floor on night when everything changed now occupied place of honor in territorial museum that commemorated triumph of constitutional law over criminal corruption. Its display accompanied by documents that proved how individual courage combined with federal authority could protect innocent people from systematic exploitation by predators who viewed human decency as weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. Armand's legacy extended beyond elimination of criminal organizations to include establishment of law enforcement traditions that prioritized protection of constitutional rights over accommodation with powerful interests whose wealth had previously purchased immunity from legal consequences for activities that violated both territorial and federal law while threatening community welfare and national security through systematic theft of public resources. The fortune that Lucien had gained through federal protection of his legitimate mining claim was less important than knowledge that honest work could be rewarded, rather than punished in territories where constitutional government provided security for citizens whose rights were guaranteed by principles too fundamental to be corrupted by criminal organizations that viewed governmental authority as commodity to be acquired rather than responsibility to be honored through service to public welfare that democracy was supposed to protect. As sunset painted mountains in colors that reminded him of blood spilled to protect constitutional principles from criminal corruption, Lucien understood that true fortune wasn't measured in silver extracted from earth, but in communities where children could grow up believing that justice was possible when decent people were willing to stand up for principles that were more important than personal safety or social approval from neighbors who might prefer accommodation with evil over resistance that required sacrifice for protection of innocent people who deserved better than abandonment to predators who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited rather than neighbors deserving respect and protection under constitutional law that meant something when enforced by people willing to risk everything for others.